I was asked to discuss the interaction between academic and policy community in the area of insecurity with the question, do we recognize paradigm change when we see it? I would slightly shift the key question to, do we want to recognize paradigm change when we see it? Yeah, because I think that would be for me the question. So, and then I have like 25 minutes for my presentation, and then I'm happy also if you challenge maybe, or you add also some to my assumptions. So, as a person who is trying to advise German decision makers since more than a decade on Russia, Eastern Europe, and trends in the post-Soviet region, I have to admit that I more or less failed. I'm even skeptical in the current situation where there is a high demand on Russia, Ukraine, and Eastern Europe expertise, I think in all our countries, if our knowledge is really transferred into policymaking. I'm very skeptical in many ways. If the paradigm change with the war really changes into also a mental shift, because I think that's also the way how policy is making and also how decision makers are thinking in many of our systems. And let me start with a personal example. After the second Minsk agreement in 2015, I participated in a workshop in the German Foreign Office on future scenarios for Ukraine. So it was really directly after the second Minsk agreement was negotiated. And we had, after the workshop, a small group of key decision makers in the Foreign Office, including the State Secretary level. So those people who have negotiated or participated in the negotiation, we had like a small workshop. I was asking if we have a plan B to the two Minsk agreements, arguing that might have stopped the big war for now, but will not stop further Russian aggression in Ukraine. And the reaction was, we have only plan A, and I should shut up asking these kind of questions. So I think that was for me. And it has to work, and it will work. Yeah, I think that was also the reaction. For me, that was a decisive moment when I understood that realistic analysis is not demanded by the decision makers, but we should rather confirm the right approach and policy in many ways. So this is at least my experience. Working and living in a post-knowledge world, driven by opinions, emotions, and perceptions. And I think we see this also very much in the social media on this war. Russia's brutal conventional war in Ukraine, in the framework of global insecurity and uncertainty, is a paradigm shift and leads to a kind of renaissance of knowledge. I would say this. We can see a huge interest in regional expertise on Russia, Ukraine, and other conflict regions in our societies and decision-making circles. Like also military expertise. Military experts were always the freaks in a way. About the very functioning of weapons, tanks, and military strategies. I think there's really a kind of a renaissance of this. And even Kremlin astrology is back, yeah, in a way, trying to explain how does Putin thinks, how does he functions, and how he will react, or will he even throw a nuclear bomb? I think these questions you get like every day, also from serious decision makers. And because of the huge changes at the same time in the world as we know it, to our security situation, energy, economic and domestic policy, and way of life, there is a huge interest among stakeholders and the wider public to understand what is going on and what does it mean for us and how it will end. At the same time, we observe that there are suddenly many experts on the relevant issues where I didn't know that they exist. So here we are back to a post-knowledge area. I do not think that this leads to a paradigm shift in the big gap between academics, think tanks, and policy making. And I have here like 5 points to explain why this will not work. So the first point is, our foreign policy is not about strategy, risk analysis, and scenarios. And even if we do a lot of scenario workshops and develop strategies, but it's about bureaucracy. So in Western societies, we have a bureaucratic, but not strategic foreign policy driven by institutional logic of the system. People who are working, for instance, in the Foreign Office, they are generalists and should not know too much about one country or topic. They have no interest in taking risks or challenging the mainstream patterns, but they act in a bureaucratic and political framework which rather confirms the existing discourses and patterns. Second, we have in our systems a competition between different institutions and bureaucracies about access and information, but not about knowledge. In the German case, that goes so far that ministries compete with each other about access to the top information, what is important at this moment, and they do not share information with each other. They rather keep information in their framework. We have a pillarization of institutional behavior and politics. That means an inability of decision makers to link different kinds of politics, structural developments in different regions with each other, or because of the institutional design of our systems, and makes it very difficult to find answers to the disappearing boundaries between domestic and foreign policy. So it's even more difficult because these disappearing boundaries would mean more cooperation among institutions, which on one hand dealing with foreign and security policy and others with domestic issues. And that's very difficult also to bridge. Third, domestic policy drives foreign policy. So if you look to parties and members of parliament, they are not elected for foreign policy topics, but with domestic issues. You have a decline of interest and knowledge about regions, logic of foreign and security politics. Many parliamentarians speak only one language, but very few know Russian or any Eastern European language. And those who know were often from the older generation with a different political legacy. That means with every election, you start with a great majority of the MPs from zero. These people are driven by the interest of their constituencies. I have very nice examples like cheap gas, and then meaning Nord Stream 2 is a great thing, or specific interests of companies in the regions they are coming from. So there are also a lot of vested interests. The very few really knowledgeable MPs on foreign policy, they are mostly outsiders. So fourth, a lot about our foreign policy is driven by other interests. Talking about Russia and energy dependency or China's market dependency, German foreign economic policy was driven by company interest, but not by strategic economic or security interests. There was a huge impact on lobbying of specific companies on investment in Russia or in positive political environment for better access to Russian stakeholders, which had a huge impact on political decision-making. That means that the interests and analysis of the companies were often more decisive in policymaking than the analysis of experts or academics. And I think the irony is here for me that also companies made risk analysis in using the expertise, and I participated in this, and they had a pretty good picture of what is going on, but they promoted a different policy because that was in their economic benefit. Fifth, the lack of permeability in our systems between academic institutions, think tanks, and ministries and other political institutions lead to parallel worlds and mindsets who often do not fit with each other or speak different languages. Even if they meet, they all follow their different logics. Decision makers often have a concrete problem now for which they need a solution as soon as possible, be it specific crisis or interest for policy. They mostly think short-term and have no time and interest in big readings or understand the real complexity of an issue. Academics are looking either in long-term processes, patterns, or very specific topics, which are often abstract and seems to be not relevant or feasible with the current demand of decision makers. So I think there's really a mismatch also in demand and what is provided. So that leads me to my second part. What are crucial structural problems we face in our systems? I think what we could observe in the past decade was the end of area studies and the era of global studies. there was less and less demand for people who did area studies and know the languages, the political culture, or the countries itself. Big global challenges like climate change, democracy, social demands stand in the focus of research and demand. The lack of expertise about countries like Russia, Ukraine, or Central Asian states was reflected in a lack of demand to understand these regions and countries. Many institutions which studied during the Cold War, the Soviet Union, have been closed. In Germany, it was under Gerhard Schröder when they closed this institution. And the same is the case with the chairs at the universities, especially in political and social science. And I think we also know very few economists or military experts looking on the region have been produced by universities. So we have really a deficit also in some areas. At the same time, resources for applied research was cut down with a strong impact on understanding trends in countries like Russia. The perception how the world is developing and that Russia will develop like our system for too long persisted in the political and public discourses because of the lack of research and expertise on different trends in the region, in the country and the post-Soviet region. A strong Russia-centric approach in many countries, including my country, against the trend of disintegration and nation building in the post-Soviet region persisted. Second point is a refusal of reality. The cost-benefit analysis of decision makers has often nothing to do with the real demand and the political reality. We now listen a lot of politicians and bureaucrats who are saying that they did not know that Russia and Putin are like that and that they were surprised with the war, and if they would have known, they would have acted differently. I can only say many of these stakeholders would have known if they wanted to know and if they would have listened. With some of these people, my colleagues and I spoke, and they were not only not interested in our analysis, they were even arguing against it, saying this and that expert should not create problems, and we have other interests. So I met several German foreign ministers in private conversation with a small group of experts and telling them several problems will come with Russia. We have to prepare to the further disintegration of the post-Soviet region, and you have to prepare yourself, but also to the society to that. So you have to communicate the change of policy. The reaction was mostly that it is too difficult, too costly, and it might happen differently. The short-term thinking of decision makers, the provincialization of politics, and the rise of populists, which often lead to the argument that we cannot do anything because that's too costly for the society, and it would strengthen populist support, the trend of the refusal of reality and keeping the comfort zone. Being afraid of to explain the society that we have to change our policy and that will come with costs was often a knockout argument against any fundamental change in our Russia policy. So the public discourse and to counter mainstream opinions was an argument against political change. Another problem, I think, is Eurocentrism and also a kind of ecocentrism. We could only imagine a world in a way we live and think and how our postmodern society functions. To think out of the box or beyond the paradigms was an issue of scenario workshops, but not policy making and thinking. To keep the comfort zone, define the level and amount of our action, or rather non-action. Not doing something became often even better than to do something. The argument that the longer we wait with countering and acting, the more costly it will become was countered by the argument that in short term, the costs are too high. So we have very much short-term thinking political decision making. And again, bureaucratic systems do not like changes or risks. They try to minimize risks and what could disrupt the systems or bring changes. So you create a reality and act in this reality, even if outside of your system, the world looks and functions differently. So, and I want to just to bring here very quick two examples in the framework of the German Ostpolitik. Yeah, because I think they are very telling also. So taking the German very specific example of the reinterpretation of Ostpolitik after the Cold War, has become a key feature to justify investment and engagement with an authoritarian state like Russia. When economic interdependence changes societies to a better, you have even a mission when you invest in countries like Russia and China. The level of knowledge and the will to understand Putin's Russia was limited. Even the German ambassadors to Moscow for decades did not speak Russian. At the same time, the Russian system used the opportunism and openness of the German system to do a successful norm transfer in the other direction. So the consequence was not democratization and rule of law in Russia, but informality, corruption, intransparency in the German system at all levels. The interdependence made the German system vulnerable in terms of impact and lobbying specific relations with Russia. And how you want to create a win-win situation with a win-lose thinking elites. So we were always talking about win-win situations, but Russian elites, as we all know, think in win-lose terms. Nord Stream 2 was obviously undermining unity in Europe, and the transatlantic relations made Ukraine vulnerable to Russian aggression and created an instrument of impact on German politics and discourse. But it was named by nearly until the end, so until the war has started, by any key decision maker, including Chancellor Merkel, Federal President Steinmeier, and also Chancellor Scholz, a purely economic project, or one of the last bridges towards Russia, as Steinmeier once said about it. This refusal of real facts and analysis was driven by domestic opportunism, political bargaining, and successful lobbying of business interests. As Kremlin protocols show, that the then Minister of Economy, Sigmar Gabriel, was promising to President Putin in a meeting in the Kremlin in 2015 that Germany will bring Nord Stream 2 under German legislation, but not European, to get the certification process smoothly done. It was great that the Kremlin published this. After the war in Ukraine started, the same Sigmar Gabriel, who was not anymore Minister of Economy, was arguing he had to support selling the second biggest gas storage to Gazprom, which is in Germany, because of the liberalization policy of the EU. So he was blaming the EU for his policy. What else do you need in the Kremlin to undermine unity in Europe and credibility of member state politics if you have such politicians in charge? And maybe the last example before conclusions and outlook is on the Zeitenwende speech of Olaf Scholz. He made a speech directly after the war started, when the brutal reality outran the imagined reality, and Scholz could not ignore this anymore. The pressure was so strong that there was a need for a fundamental change, or at least the imitation of a big change. Yes, there was a paradigm change. The German leadership recognized that Russia's invasion in Ukraine is also about German security. I think that is really important. And this 100 billion military spending is a huge step for the country. But this speech and decision was not supported by a strategy or any strategic shift. It was again followed by a hesitant policy, taking no risks and providing no leadership. So I think too late and too little, like the German government is normally reacting to Russian provocations. Even if Germany now develops a national security strategy, the same people with the same mindset who were before responsible will have to implement it. Furthermore, there's a lack of instruments and the bureaucratic logic stays the same. So I think no strategic, cultural and mental Zeitenwende took place in Germany. It is first of all about showing action and strong rhetoric. But yeah, it's slowly moving, it's slowly changing, but I think it needs really a mental and cultural change. So very short now, the conclusion and the outlook. I think we did with US colleagues, that's maybe another example, we did with US colleagues between 2017 and 18 scenario workshops on how to deal with the Russia challenge in Ukraine. And the worst case scenarios included a Russian attack on Odessa, taking the whole south of Ukraine till Moldova and Transnistria and creating Novorossiya. We further had a scenario of an accident or hybrid attack on an Ukrainian nuclear power plant with a pollution of big parts of Europe as a shock moment created by Russia. These were worst case scenarios or also black swans, and normally they don't happen. So I think that that's really the worst case scenario. But at least I think they were at our mind. And we were even playing these scenarios with European, German, and US decision makers. So also key people in several European countries, in the US and in Europe. So even if we recognize paradigm changes, we do not want to see or accept them or let them become part of our calculation because the short-term costs seems to be too high. Our political systems do first of all crisis management and public diplomacy, but not strategy or preventative policy. There's a lack of strategic culture to adapt to strategies, would need a mindset and cultural change, and that takes time. The level of bureaucracy slowed down adaptation and try to create processes which they can control. Russia's war in Ukraine is a paradigm change in terms of that we cannot ignore the reality anymore. It challenged Eurocentric and Western-centric approaches, I think also with regard to the sanction policy, of analyzing other states or trends who do not fit to our paradigm. To accept that it will not end and we will not return to what we have before, even if the hope in our societies is still there, that it will end soon is very, very difficult. So even if there is an academic analysis and research on how our system functions, there are proposals what have to be done. This does not lead into policy making. I think the knowledge and the research exists. Yeah, I think that's true. But the demand will only be there when the crisis or the paradigm change has already took place, or we are in the middle of the crisis. Different languages and way of thinking make it very difficult to explain and understand the functioning of systems like the Russian one to policymakers. Our systems are not ready to absorb this knowledge and to transfer it into politics. Other factors like public opinion, economic interests, different cost-benefit calculations impact more on policy making than research and knowledge. Looking into the German Foreign Office in times of insecurity with Russia's war in Ukraine, you can see, first of all, people who are overstretched by the simultaneity of crisis and the dynamics of the events. They are so occupied with internal processes and reacting to it that they have even limited time to meet experts or to think about strategies. So I'm rather skeptical about the adaptability of our systems to the reality and the real improvement of interaction of academics and policymakers. And I don't know what I think what we can do is maybe adapting more with the language, adapting more with the mindset, and I think also if you see with the securitization now of everything, there are kind of changes, yeah, but I think it's very much short-term driven, crisis driven, then really shifting into a substantial or sustainable strategic approach. And it's very much driven also by outside pressure. So we have to react. Yeah, we are in a situation of escalation, and then the systems are able also in a way to adapt. So I don't think that they are completely dysfunctional. But I think my main argument is we would have known if we wanted to know, but yeah, we did not want to know also, and we did not want to see the reality. Thank you very much.